No one saw him leave the apartment. No camera recorded him. No door was opened. And yet, his body traveled through the building like garbage. Prologue. The body was found where no one ever looked by choice. That was the first thing Edward Hale understood when he saw the photographs. The disposal chamber was clean, not sterile, but intentionally neutral. Concrete walls, steel hatches, soft industrial lighting designed to reveal malfunctions, not meaning. This was not a place where people lingered. It existed to complete a task and erase itself from memory immediately afterward. And yet, there he was. The man had been identified within minutes, a resident of the building, a penthouse, top 3 floors, private elevator, security clearance that opened doors without leaving hesitation behind, a life designed around the idea that inconvenience was something other people handled. The irony did not go unnoticed. According to the initial report, the system had worked exactly as intended. Waste intake, pressure differential, transport cycle, temporary containment, all automated, all logged, no errors, no alerts, no anomaly significant enough to explain why a human body had entered the system unnoticed. Edward read that line twice. Unnoticed by whom, he wondered. The building stood at the edge of the city's financial district, a vertical statement of restraint and confidence. Glass, steel, muted lighting, nothing excessive. Luxury here was quiet, disciplined, efficient. Residents did not know one another's schedules. They did not know the names of the people who cleaned their floors or maintained the pipes behind the walls. They did not need to. That was the point. Garbage did not travel through hallways in this building. It did not share elevators with people. It did not wait politely by doors. Each floor was equipped with a sealed intake system. Waste was deposited, categorized, and removed through a network of vacuum tubes that bypassed every space meant for human presence. Residents called it invisible living. Edward called it delegation. The timeline, at first glance, was reassuring. Cameras showed the victim entering his apartment the previous evening. No one else entered, no one left. His private elevator had not been used after midnight. Corridor footage was clean. Security logs showed nothing irregular. And yet, sometime before dawn, his body had traveled downward through the building like refuse. No one saw him leave. The disposal system logs were precise, too precise. They showed routine activity, standard waste cycles from multiple floors, staggered to prevent pressure overload. Each deposit was linked to an access card, each timestamp accounted for. According to the system, no one from the victim's floor had disposed of anything during the relevant window. That was the problem. Edward arrived while the police were still deciding which explanation felt least uncomfortable. Accident, mechanical failure, a moment of recklessness amplified by alcohol or exhaustion. Someone suggested sleepwalking. Someone else suggested drugs. All of it relied on the same assumption, that the system had been surprised. Edward did not believe systems were surprised. He walked through the building slowly, taking note of what people did not look at. The walls were seamless, the doors unmarked. The disposal intakes were recessed, discreet, designed not to interrupt the illusion of cleanliness. No smell, no sound, no reminder of consequence. Edward stopped in front of one intake hatch on a mid-level floor. It looked harmless, almost elegant. This, he thought, was how you moved a body without being seen. Not through force, not through secrecy, through habit. The residents spoke in the language of convenience. The staff spoke in the language of procedure. The system spoke in timestamps and pressure levels. No one spoke the language of responsibility. Edward wrote a single line in his notebook before closing it again. If no one touches the waste, no one feels accountable for where it goes. Somewhere above him, apartments remained lit, lives continued uninterrupted. Somewhere below, the system waited for its next task. Edward knew this case would not be about violence. It would be about routing. And the question would not be who pushed the body inside. It would be who understood that once something enters the system, it is no longer human. Chapter 1. The Clean Building. Edward Hale learned more about the building in the first 10 minutes than most residents had learned in years. It was not because he was observant in any extraordinary way. It was because he was looking for things that were meant not to be noticed. The lobby was designed to feel transitional rather than welcoming. No excess light, no reflective surfaces that demanded attention. The air smelled faintly neutral, neither fresh nor artificial. Even the sound was controlled. Footsteps softened by material choices, voices absorbed rather than echoed. This was not a place where people arrived. It was a place where they passed through. Cleanliness here was not a feature. It was a philosophy. Residents moved through the space with practiced indifference. They did not greet one another. They did not acknowledge the staff beyond the minimum politeness required to confirm their own status. Everyone behaved as if the building were an extension of their private space, not a shared environment. Edward recognized the pattern immediately. This was not community. This was coordinated isolation. The concierge desk was positioned centrally but slightly recessed, present but not intrusive. The man behind it knew everyone by face and almost no one by name. Edward introduced himself and watched the flicker of calculation cross the concierge's expression. Authority was assessed quickly here. Titles mattered less than confidence. "You're here about the incident," the concierge said. Edward nodded. "Has anyone used that word yet?" he asked. The concierge hesitated. "No," he said. "Management prefers discretion." Edward thanked him and moved on. The elevators were silent, not merely quiet, but engineered to eliminate the sense of vertical movement. There was no lurch, no audible acceleration. Floors appeared on the display without ceremony. Edward rode alone, watching the doors close with a finality that felt intentional. On the victim's floor, the hallway was immaculate, too immaculate. No scuff marks, no personal items, doors flush with the walls, indistinguishable from one another except by discrete numbering. Edward walked slowly, counting steps, noting distances. He stopped in front of the apartment door. This was where the man had last been seen alive. Inside, the apartment told the same story the building did. Minimalism without warmth. Expensive materials chosen for durability rather than comfort, surfaces that resisted fingerprints, furniture arranged to suggest use without inviting it. Edward stood in the living room and listened. The silence here was not empty. It was maintained. There were no signs of struggle, no overturned objects, no broken glass. The kitchen was spotless. The waste intake hatch, recessed into the cabinetry, was closed and flush, indistinguishable from a storage panel unless you knew what you were looking for. Edward opened it carefully. The opening was just large enough to accept a standard disposal bag. No jagged edges, no sharp metal. The system was designed to be safe, compliant, forgiving. It assumed cooperation. Edward closed the hatch and stepped back. The idea that a human body could enter this system voluntarily felt absurd, and yet absurdity often masked intention. He left the apartment and requested access to the building's management offices. They were located on a lower floor, deliberately distant from both luxury and service areas, neutral territory. The building manager was a woman in her 40s with a background in operations. She spoke in structured sentences and avoided speculation instinctively. "We've never had an incident like this," she said. Edward nodded. "You mean involving a body," he replied. She did not correct him. "Our systems are audited regularly," she continued. "The disposal network is closed loop, no external access. Everything is tracked." "Tracked by whom?" Edward asked. "The system," she said. Edward smiled faintly. "That's usually the answer," he said. She showed him the schematics, vertical shafts hidden behind reinforced walls, pressure regulators, intake valves controlled by access authentication, a design optimized for efficiency and hygiene. Edward traced the route with his finger. "This bypasses every human space," he said. "Yes," she replied, almost proudly. "That's the point." Edward looked up. "And if something goes wrong?" he asked. She hesitated. "Then we review the logs," she said. Edward nodded. "And if the logs show nothing wrong?" he asked. She considered that. "Then nothing went wrong," she said. Edward wrote that sentence down. Later, he spoke with residents, carefully, casually, no formal interviews. He asked about daily routines, about convenience, about what they liked most about living here. "I never think about garbage. It just disappears," one woman said. "That's the beauty of it," another resident added. "You don't have to deal with unpleasant things." Edward asked if anyone had ever had trouble with the disposal system. A man laughed. "It's idiot-proof," he said. "You'd have to try pretty hard to mess it up." Edward thanked him. The staff told a different story. Cleaning personnel spoke of access schedules, of service windows when systems were overridden briefly for maintenance. Security mentioned restricted floors, temporary deactivations, manual modes that existed but were rarely used. Rarely used, Edward knew, did not mean unknown. By the end of the day, Edward had formed a preliminary conclusion. This building did not hide crime. It hid responsibility. Everyone trusted the system because it worked, and because it worked, no one imagined it could be used deliberately. Garbage was something people here did not think about. It was not personal. It was not moral. It was logistical. Edward returned to the lobby as evening settled. The building glowed softly, an island of order in the city's noise. Somewhere inside its walls, a man had been reduced to a routing problem. Edward Hale understood then that solving this case would require a shift in perspective. He would not be following a suspect. He would be following a process. Chapter 2: The System That Works. Edward Hale did not distrust systems by default. He distrusted certainty. The disposal system of the building inspired certainty. It was presented not as a feature, but as an inevitability, a natural evolution of urban living. Waste, the manager said, was no longer a human concern. It was an engineering problem that had already been solved. Edward began where belief was strongest, the logs. The interface was clean, almost elegant. Time-stamped entries, color-coded cycles, pressure curves displayed as smooth, predictable lines. Each disposal event was recorded with precision, down to the second. Each intake was linked to an access credential. Each cycle closed itself with a reassuring green confirmation. No anomalies detected. That phrase appeared so often, it began to lose meaning. Edward leaned closer, not to the screen, but to the assumptions behind it. Systems like this were built to detect deviation, not intent. They were excellent at answering the question, "Did something go wrong?" and almost useless at answering, "Did something go exactly as planned?" He asked the systems engineer to walk him through a standard cycle. The engineer was young, confident, and visibly proud. He spoke with the fluency of someone who trusted diagrams more than people. "Each intake hatch is authenticated," the engineer explained. "You can't open it without a valid access card. The The system records who, when, and from which floor. And after that? Edward asked. Vacuum transport. High-pressure differential moves the waste through sealed tubes to the collection chamber. No human interaction. Edward nodded. And if something unusual enters the system? He asked. The engineer smiled. It doesn't, he said. Edward did not challenge that. Not yet. He asked about manual overrides. There are maintenance modes, the engineer admitted, but those require authorization, multiple layers. Edward noted the plural. Who authorizes them? Edward asked. Facilities management, the engineer said. Sometimes security, sometimes external contractors. And how often are those modes used? Edward asked. The engineer hesitated. Rarely, he said, mostly during scheduled service windows. Edward thanked him and requested the maintenance schedule. The schedule was as orderly as everything else. Windows carefully planned during low usage hours, notifications sent automatically, overrides logged and closed. Nothing stood out. At first glance. Edward printed the schedule and laid it beside the disposal logs. He did not look for overlap, he looked for rhythm. Patterns that repeated not because they were necessary, but because they were convenient. He found one. Every night between 2:40 and 3:10 a.m., the system entered a brief diagnostic phase. Pressure levels recalibrated, valves tested, no waste movement recorded. A quiet pause built into the night. Why that window? Edward asked. The engineer shrugged. Low activity, he said. Statistically optimal. Edward nodded. And does anyone monitor it in real time? He asked. The engineer shook his head. It's automated, he said. Alerts only trigger if something deviates. Edward wrote that down. Edward next spoke with security. They trusted the cameras. The footage showed nothing unusual. No body in the corridors, no struggle in elevators, no suspicious movement. The building was a perfect alibi. Edward asked a simple question. Where do the cameras stop? He said. The security chief gestured vaguely. Human spaces, he said. Hallways, elevators, lobbies. And service areas? Edward asked. Limited coverage, the chief said. No reason to monitor those constantly. Edward nodded. And disposal shafts? He asked. The chief laughed softly. Those are sealed, he said. There's nothing to see. Edward did not laugh. By midday, Edward understood the psychology of the system. It was trusted because it was boring. It was boring because it was invisible. And it was invisible because it worked. No one wanted to imagine that something deliberate could move through it unnoticed. That would require acknowledging that responsibility had been outsourced along with the waste. Edward returned to the logs again. He focused on the victim's floor. No disposal events recorded after midnight. That was the cornerstone of the current theory. If no one had used the system, then the victim could not have entered it through normal means. Edward asked the engineer a question he had been holding. What happens if the intake hatch is opened, but nothing is deposited? He asked. The engineer frowned. The system would still log the access, he said. And if something is deposited, but the system is paused? Edward asked. The engineer hesitated. It would queue the item, he said. Transport would resume once the cycle restarts. Edward nodded slowly. And if the queue clears during a diagnostic phase? He asked. The engineer looked uncertain. It shouldn't, he said. Diagnostics don't usually include transport. Usually, Edward repeated. The engineer pulled up additional documentation. Edge cases, rare scenarios, the kind no one read unless something forced them to. Edward found what he was looking for there. A footnote. In the event of manual calibration, queued material may be redirected for pressure equalization. Redirected. Edward underlined the word. That afternoon, Edward visited the collection chamber. It was larger than he expected, industrial and impersonal. Containers lined the walls, each tagged and time-stamped. Everything was designed for sorting, not scrutiny. Waste moved in bulk, not as individual items. Edward imagined a body arriving here, not violently, not suddenly, but as part of a process, reduced from person to payload. The staff here had not questioned it. Why would they? The system did not ask questions. It delivered. Edward spoke with a worker who had been on duty that night. "Did anything seem unusual?" Edward asked. The man thought carefully. "No," he said. "Everything came in clean." Clean. Edward thanked him and left. By evening, Edward had reached a conclusion that unsettled him more than any violent act would have. The system did not fail. It performed exactly as designed. It authenticated access, it transported material, it logged cycles, it avoided human spaces, and in doing so, it allowed a human body to disappear without being seen. Edward wrote in his notebook, "The more efficient a system becomes, the easier it is to hide intention inside it." Tomorrow, he would stop looking at what the system recorded. He would start looking at what it ignored. Chapter 3. What the Cameras Didn't See. Edward Hale trusted cameras the way he trusted mirrors. They reflected faithfully, but only what they were placed in front of. The security footage from the building was flawless, too flawless. Edward watched it in long, uninterrupted segments, refusing summaries or accelerated playback. He wanted to feel the boredom the system relied on. Hallways remained empty. Elevators opened and closed with mechanical patience. No one carried anything unusual. No one struggled. No one hurried. The victim appeared once, entering his apartment shortly after 11, and then never again. According to the cameras, the man had simply ceased to exist. Edward paused the footage at 11:17 p.m., the moment the apartment door closed behind the victim. He leaned back and considered the geometry of the building. From that point on, the man could only move in three ways: through the door, through the windows, or through infrastructure. The windows were sealed. High-altitude safety glass, sensors intact, no pressure anomalies recorded. The door had not opened again. That left the third option, infrastructure. Edward returned to the floor plans and overlaid them mentally with the camera map. Human visibility ended exactly where convenience began. The design was elegant. The cleaner the living experience, the fewer witnesses it produced. He walked the route himself. From the victim's apartment to the nearest camera blind spot took less than 6 steps. The disposal intake hatch sat just outside the main line of sight, recessed into cabinetry that merged seamlessly with the wall. A person could stand there without appearing on camera if they knew where to place their body. Edward tested it. From the hallway, the hatch was invisible. From the camera's angle, it did not exist at all. Edward smiled faintly. This was not an oversight. This was design optimization. The security chief insisted the footage proved innocence. "No one moved him," he said. "You can't fake that." Edward nodded. "I'm not suggesting anyone moved him," Edward replied. "I'm suggesting he stopped being someone the cameras were designed to see." The chief frowned. "That doesn't make sense," he said. Edward disagreed silently. It made perfect sense. Edward began reconstructing the night minute by minute. The victim returned home alone. He did not appear intoxicated. His posture was steady, his gait normal, no signs of distress. Edward paused repeatedly, studying micro details, the way the man adjusted his jacket, the moment he hesitated before unlocking his door. Hesitation mattered. Inside the apartment there were no cameras. Privacy was a selling point. Edward imagined the interior again. Clean surfaces, minimal furniture, the intake hatch blending into the kitchen like a non-thought. Edward asked himself a simple question. What would make a man approach that hatch at night? Not accident, not confusion, not force. Routine. Edward interviewed the victim's personal assistant the following morning. He was obsessive about order, she said, didn't like anything left out. Even at night? Edward asked. Especially at night, she replied. He said clutter affected his sleep. Edward nodded. And did he use the disposal system often? Edward asked. Every day, she said, sometimes multiple times. Edward thanked her. Routine, he thought, was the most reliable accomplice. Edward returned to the footage and watched the victim's floor again, this time focusing not on movement but on absence. No disposal events were logged. That was the official position. But cameras did not record sound, and they did not record intention. Edward requested access to pressure sensor data for the victim's floor during the night. The engineer hesitated, then complied. The graphs were subtle, almost boring. Almost. Edward traced one line slowly. Between 2:46 and 2:49 a.m., pressure levels on the victim's intake line fluctuated slightly. Not enough to trigger an alert, not enough to register as transport, just enough to indicate engagement. Edward tapped the screen. "What's that?" he asked. The engineer frowned. "Minor variance," he said. "Could be thermal." "Could it be manual?" Edward asked. The engineer hesitated. "In theory," he said, "but it wouldn't move anything." Edward nodded. "Not yet," he said. Edward turned his attention to people the cameras never cared about. Cleaning staff, maintenance workers, night supervisors, people whose presence was expected, unremarkable, and therefore functionally invisible. One name appeared repeatedly in service logs near the diagnostic window. A facilities coordinator, mid-level, trusted, authorized for temporary overrides during calibration cycles. Someone who understood the building not as a home, but as a machine. Edward did not accuse. He asked questions. "How often do you walk the service corridors?" Edward asked. "Every night," the coordinator replied. "And the cameras?" Edward asked. "They're not in the service shafts," the man said. "No reason for them to be." Edward nodded. "And if something unusual appeared in the system?" The man shrugged. "The system tells us." Edward wrote that down. "The system tells us." By late afternoon, Edward had isolated the core contradiction. The victim had not left his apartment as a person. He had left it as material. The cameras did not see him because they were not designed to see waste. The logs did not flag him because the system did not classify bodies as exceptional. Edward stood in front of the building again as evening fell, watching residents arrive home effortlessly. Doors opened, lights adjusted, comfort resumed. No one thought about what disappeared beneath their feet. Edward wrote another line in his notebook. If something exits through a system no one watches, it does not count as movement. Tomorrow, Edward would descend below the floors meant for living. He would go where things went once they were no longer considered worth seeing. Chapter 4. The Invisible Floor. The elevator did not have a button for this level. Edward Hale found that detail quietly satisfying. Invisible places were rarely marked for convenience. They were accessed by procedure, not by choice. The facilities coordinator used a key card and a secondary code. The doors closed. The elevator descended past the residential floors without slowing, and the lighting shifted subtly. Brighter, whiter, less forgiving. The kind of light meant to reveal problems, not comfort people. "This isn't a floor," the coordinator said, as if anticipating the question. "It's a service layer." Edward nodded. Service layers were where buildings stopped pretending to be humane. When the doors opened, the sound changed immediately. A low, constant hum replaced the silence above. Air moved here with purpose. Pipes ran openly along the ceiling, labeled and color-coded. There was no attempt to hide function behind design. "This is where everything connects," the coordinator said. "Waste, ventilation, pressure control, all the things residents never want to think about." Edward stepped out and took his time. The corridor stretched longer than expected, branching into narrower passages marked with technical identifiers instead of names. No artwork, no finishes meant to soften edges. The walls bore scuffs and scratches from equipment moved without ceremony. "This level isn't on any residential map," Edward said. "No, there's no reason for it to be." Edward looked at him. "There's always a reason. It's just not usually a good one." They walked. Edward noticed cameras here, but fewer, older, and positioned differently. These were not surveillance tools meant to establish narratives. They were monitoring devices, pointed at machinery rather than people. "Do these record continuously?" Edward asked. The coordinator shook his head. "Only during flagged events, storage limitations." Edward nodded. Another invisible choice. They reached the disposal junction. It was larger than the intake hatches suggested, a wide chamber where multiple vertical lines converged before being redirected downward. Valves, pressure locks, emergency bypasses. Everything was designed for flow, not inspection. "This is where everything pauses, briefly, during system checks," Edward said. Edward walked slowly around the chamber. "How briefly?" Edward asked. "Depends," the coordinator replied. "Usually under 5 minutes." "Usually," Edward repeated. The coordinator smiled uneasily. "Nothing here is meant to stop," Edward said. Edward agreed silently. He crouched near one of the junction points, examining a valve assembly. There were signs of recent handling, not damage, adjustment. Someone had touched this, not to break it, but to guide it. "Who has access here?" Edward asked. "Authorized personnel only. Facilities, maintenance, emergency response." "And residents?" Edward asked. "No," the coordinator said. "Never." Edward stood. "Except when they are no longer treated as residents." The coordinator frowned, but said nothing. Edward asked to see the override protocols. They were stored on a secured terminal nearby. Dry documentation, flowcharts, contingencies, rare event handling. Edward scanned until he found what he expected: manual pressure equalization. A procedure meant for one thing: preventing system damage when something unexpected entered the network. Unexpected, Edward noted, did not mean impossible. "This override," Edward said, pointing, "who can initiate it?" The coordinator hesitated. "I can. So can my supervisor." "And when was it last used?" Edward asked. The coordinator checked the logs. "During the diagnostic window," he said, "around 2:50 a.m. Edward looked up. "At what time?" Edward asked. "During the diagnostic window," the coordinator replied, "around 2:50 a.m. Edward nodded slowly. That was the same window. "Why?" Edward asked. The coordinator swallowed. "Pressure imbalance," he said. "Minor." "Caused by what?" Edward asked. The coordinator hesitated longer this time. "Unregistered material," he said. Edward felt the final piece settle. They continued walking deeper into the service layer. Edward noticed something else here: people. Not many. A night technician checking a panel, a cleaner pushing a cart. All of them moved with the same practiced invisibility. They did not acknowledge Edward. They did not need to. They were accustomed to being unseen. Edward stopped one of them gently. "Did you notice anything unusual that night?" he asked. The technician thought carefully. "There was a delay," he said, "a hold in the system." "A hold?" Edward asked. "Yes," the technician said, "something heavy." Edward nodded. "And did that concern you?" he asked. The technician shrugged. "No," he said, "the system handled it." Edward thanked him. Handled. That word again. By the time Edward returned to the elevator, the shape of the crime was clear. The victim had not been moved through hallways. He had not been carried through doors. He had not been seen because no one had been trained to see him. At some point during the night, the intake hatch in the victim's apartment had been opened during a diagnostic pause. The system had been in a state where logging was partial, transport delayed, oversight minimal. The body entered the network not as a person, but as a payload. A manual override guided it, not violently, not hurriedly, correctly. Edward stood alone in the elevator as it ascended back toward the visible floors. The higher it went, the quieter it became. He wrote one final line for the chapter in his notebook. The building did not hide the body, it processed it. Tomorrow, Edward would trace the hand that knew exactly how to do that. Chapter 5. The Route of Disposal. Edward Hale never described the act itself first. He described the route, because once the route was understood, intention became irrelevant. The building did not care why something entered its system. It cared only where it would go next. Edward gathered the relevant people in the same neutral meeting room the management preferred for crises. No windows, no decoration. A place designed to feel temporary, even when the decisions made inside it were not. The facilities coordinator sat opposite him, pale, controlled, not panicked. Edward noticed that immediately. Panic belonged to people who had acted impulsively. This man had acted procedurally. Edward placed the schematics on the table. "We're going to walk through this," he said, "not emotionally, mechanically." No one objected. The victim returns home at 11:17 p.m. He's alone. Cameras confirm that. No signs of distress, no alcohol, no drugs. Edward looked up. "You knew his habits," he said. The coordinator nodded slightly. "He used the disposal hatch every night, sometimes more than once. He didn't like clutter." The coordinator said nothing. Edward tapped the diagram. At 2:40 a.m., the system enters its diagnostic window. Pressure stabilization, partial logging, reduced oversight. You didn't create that window, you used it. Edward did not phrase it as an accusation. It did not need to be one. "You initiated a manual calibration," Edward said, "that paused transport without triggering alerts. Anything deposited during that time would remain in the junction chamber." Edward leaned back. "A place no camera watches." The coordinator swallowed. Edward continued. "You opened the intake hatch in the apartment," he said, "with authorized access. The system logged nothing unusual because nothing unusual happened. The hatch was opened, something was deposited." Edward paused. "The system does not classify objects by origin, only by volume and pressure." No one spoke. Edward pressed on. "The body entered the system without resistance, no struggle, no violence. Whether the man was conscious at that point is irrelevant to the system." Edward let that sentence settle. At 2:49 a.m., pressure readings spiked slightly. Not enough to trigger alarms, enough to require equalization. Edward looked directly at the coordinator. "You were already there," he said. The coordinator's jaw tightened. "You guided the routing," Edward continued, "not upward, not laterally, downward, into the collection sequence." Edward turned a page. "The system resumes transport at 2:53 a.m. Logs normalize. The body moves through the network as waste. No alarms, no alerts, no witnesses." Edward closed the folder. "And that," he said, "is when he stopped being a resident." The coordinator finally spoke. "I didn't touch him," he said. Edward nodded. "I know," he replied. "I didn't force him," the coordinator continued. Edward nodded again. "I know." "I didn't kill him," the coordinator said. Edward looked at him carefully. "No," he said. "You disposed of him." The word landed differently. It was not moral, it was logistical. Edward explained it without anger. "You understood the system," he said. "You understood that once something enters it, it ceases to exist as an object of concern. No one checks waste for identity. No one asks where it came from." Edward paused. "You didn't need violence," he said. "You needed access." The coordinator stared at the table. "He was going to expose something," the coordinator said quietly. Edward did not ask what. "He thought he was untouchable," the coordinator continued. "He thought living above everyone else meant he was outside the system." Edward nodded. "And you knew better," he said. The coordinator exhaled slowly. "I didn't think of it as killing," he said. Edward's voice was steady. "Neither did the building," he replied. Edward concluded the reconstruction carefully. "There was no moment of chaos," he said. "No error, no malfunction. The system performed exactly as designed. You simply understood where it stopped seeing people." Edward stood. "This wasn't a crime of anger," he said. "It was a crime of familiarity." He gathered his notebook. "You worked where others never went," Edward said. "You understood that waste is invisible by policy, that once something crosses that threshold, no one wants to know." Edward looked around the room. "And you trusted that everyone else would continue not looking." When Edward left the building that evening, residents passed him in the lobby. They spoke quietly into phones. They nodded at the concierge. They carried nothing unpleasant with them. The building remained immaculate. The system continued to work. Edward stopped outside and looked up. Somewhere behind the glass, people were discarding things they no longer wanted to think about. Edward wrote his final note for the case. "Modern murder doesn't require secrecy. It requires infrastructure." He closed the notebook. Behind him, the building absorbed the day without incident, and tomorrow it would do the same. Epilogue: What we choose to discard. Edward Hale did not stay to watch the consequences unfold. He never did. Consequences were rarely interesting in the way people expected. They arrived slowly, disguised as policy updates, internal memos, revised protocols. No one slammed doors, no one shouted. The building did not become a crime scene in the collective memory. It became a case study. A coordinator was removed. A contractor was questioned. A system was improved. The words were carefully chosen. Edward walked the city instead.
It was early morning, the hour when service vehicles outnumbered pedestrians. Trash trucks moved through narrow streets with mechanical patience, lifting bins, emptying contents, sealing absence behind them. No one looked inside. No one needed to. Edward stopped at a corner cafe and ordered coffee. The cup was disposable. He noticed that immediately. Designed to be held briefly, designed to be discarded without reflection. He wondered how many objects shared that fate because they were inconvenient to keep thinking about. The building issued a statement later that day. "We take safety seriously. We are cooperating fully. There is no ongoing risk to residents." Edward read it once and deleted it. Risk, he thought, was not something this place acknowledged easily. Risk required imagination, and imagination had been deliberately engineered out of the environment. Edward thought again of the victim, not of his name, not of his wealth, but of the moment he ceased to be seen. It had not been dramatic, it had not been violent, it had been procedural. Edward had seen that pattern before, in hospitals where patients became bed numbers, in companies where layoffs were called restructuring, in families where silence replaced conversation because it was easier to maintain. People did not stop caring all at once. They optimized. He finished his coffee and dropped the cup into a bin. The lid snapped shut automatically. Edward felt the quiet satisfaction of design doing its job. He also felt the unease that came with it. Later, as he boarded a train out of the city, Edward opened his notebook one last time. He did not write about the building. He wrote about a principle. What we remove from sight does not disappear. It simply moves into systems where responsibility dissolves. He closed the notebook. The train moved. Outside the window, the city slid past in layers: glass towers, service roads, industrial zones where no one lived but everyone depended on what happened there. Edward knew this would not be the last case like this. It never was. Every modern system promised cleanliness, efficiency, relief from unpleasantness, and every one of them created places where things went once they were no longer welcome. Bodies were rare, but not unheard of. Edward did not imagine himself as a warning. Warnings were ignored. He imagined himself as friction, something that slowed certainty just enough to be noticed. The building would continue to function. The disposal system would continue to work. Residents would continue to enjoy not thinking about where things went. Edward Hale could not change that, but sometimes he could change what people were forced to notice afterward, and sometimes that was enough.
No one saw him leave the apartment. No camera recorded him. No door was opened. And yet, his body traveled through the building like garbage.